On the Psychology of Love, Aquinas in dialogue with contemporary thought. The heart of the Christian message is the call to love God and neighbor. But what do we mean by love? What is love? The difficulty of this question emerges when we consider the many ways that the scriptures themselves employ the word love. The Old Testament's use of the common Hebrew word for love, ahav, illustrates this. In the space of only a few chapters, the book of Genesis employs ahav to describe a father's love for his son. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. To describe a man's love for a woman, Isaac brought her into the tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. And to describe a man's love for his favorite meal. Prepare for me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat. So from chapter 22 to 27, father's love for his son, man's love for his wife, and that same man's love for porridge. In each of these cases, the word employed is ahav, whether in its verbal or substantive forms. Are all these loves the same? And if so, what is their proper act? If, however, they are each different types of love, how do they relate to each other? In short, although the scriptures have much to say about love, they do not provide what we would call a psychology of love. So during our time this evening, I wish to investigate some of the features of love's complexity and to consider Thomas Aquinas' account of love, especially in light of contemporary developments in the scientific study of emotional attachment, can help us better understand love, both human and divine. The challenge of love becomes even more acute when we consider the confusing dynamics of romantic love. When a couple speaks of their mutual love, this can mean so many different things, and these differences can seem to exist simultaneously. Moreover, there is the troubling question of love's frequent inconstancy, even after we have professed its undying constancy. The novelist from the fine writing tradition in the United States, Annie Dillard, explores this aspect of love in her novel, The Maitrees, which, as I've shown in some of my writings, is really a continuation of Chaucer's reflection of this same dynamic in Troilus and Cresside. So with sober economy, Dillard traces what can happen to a couple's love as it passes from the green exuberance of springtime through the warmth of summer to the first gray chills of autumn. Toby Maitrey, the protagonist of the novel, abandons Lou, his wife of many years, to start anew with Dearie, his wife's best friend. Years later, Maitrey reflects on this strange experience. Quote, "Why can love apparently absolute, recur and recur? Why does love feel it is, know for certain it is, eternal and absolute every time?" Maitrey considers three possible explanations. First, perhaps the movement from one beloved to another is a natural part of our growth in love. This would mean that, quote, "everyone gathers or grows an enormous sack of love, and as he does so, he hands whole from one beloved to another." He hands this sack whole from one beloved to another. The unfortunate implication of this view is that the beloved becomes a mere means to our growth in love and our utilitarian self-fulfillment. The second possible explanation is even more troubling. Quote, "perhaps love is delusional," unquote. Maitrey paints an analogy with fishing. Quote, "the heart never learns and keeps leaping the length of its life, rising to lures," the little things that you use to catch fish, "rising to lures made of rubber but hiding hooks." We are condemned, therefore, to jump from one beloved to the next beloved, because love itself is an illusion whose allure only wounds. A third possibility is that perhaps Maitre never really loved his first wife, Lou, or his previous girlfriends. Instead, quote, having learned love by loving, he found in Deary his true mate at last. Maitre, however, rejects this explanation as well because it too denies the core of his experience, that he really loved Lou and still loves her, and that he now really loves Deary. Dillard next portrays Maitre circling for years a fourth possibility. Perhaps lasting love is simply, quote, directed will, consisting both in, quote, willful focus of attention and, quote, a custody of reactions. This view would imply that Maitre's first marriage broke up because of a failure of will. He failed to focus his attention on Lou and to guard his reactions with regard to Deary. Although Maitre seems partly to accept this portrait of love, it too, in his view, proves inadequate. Love as directed will fails to account for the emotional features of love, which Maitre describes as, quote, love's first feeling of cliff jumping. Maitre recognizes that whether love's emotion lasts 18 months or 7 years, it too, quote, must be acknowledged and accounted for. In other words, any account of love as directed will must also account for love's powerful emotional element. It is here that Aquinas' insights into love can be of service. So Aquinas' psychology of love. The perennial temptation is either to reduce love to a pure choice of the will or to a merely emotional response. For Thomas Aquinas, however, love is both. Just as the human intellect, according to Aquinas, cannot know except in and through the senses, the memory, and imagination, so too for Aquinas, the human will loves in and through the emotions, especially the bodily passion that we also call love. Aquinas follows Aristotle in affirming that we do not have despotic, but only diplomatic or political control over our emotions. So when I lift my arm, it responds. I give the command to move, it moves. But we can't do that with our emotions. We can, those who spend years in preparation can have a remarkable influence over even their heart rate, digestion, and our emotions. And yet it's not the same kind of despotism that we have over our hands and arms. Instead, it's political. Like free citizens of a republic, the emotions interject their own responses to the people and things we encounter in life. And this is how it should be. The emotions both influence our decisions, and our decisions in turn influence our emotional responses. Parentheses, there's the famous study done by Antonio Damasio of the railroad worker Phineas Gage, who was injured in a railroad accident, rather gruesome accident, but it destroyed the emotional part of the brain. And if you're fans of Star Trek, you would think that not having an emotional life allows you to reason more clearly. But actually, the reverse is the case, that the emotional memory that had accompanied him all his life provided him the experiences, the emotional memory of past events that helped him make right judgment. So he went from having a very well-ordered life to having a disordered life because the emotional part of his brain was destroyed. So people like Spock, in actual fact, are more like sociopaths than good reasons, or they reason like alligators reason. Okay, anyway, close parenthesis. This complicated mutual relationship between love as a passion and love as choice is what makes human love such a rich but also such a bewildering reality. Love is spiritual and animal. It is divine but also earthy. We are a strange amphibian. We swim in the waters of the material, but we breathe the air of the spiritual. Aquinas was of a generation that tried to understand love's complexity by placing it within a larger study of natural motion. He shared with the ancients the view that all motion in creation, even the motion of a falling stone or of a growing tree, is somehow caused by love. Now, Aquinas was not affirming a silly anthropomorphism, whereby falling stones and growing plants were viewed as consciously and passionately desiring the goals of their motion. Instead, the analogy goes in the other direction. Human action shares something in common with the action of other animals and of inanimate objects. Since human love is at the source of human action, this implies that human love also analogously shares something in common with the source of these other actions. Aquinas' philosophy of participation and analogy enables him to describe the element that these principles of action generically share in common as a type of love. So if we understand creation better, if we understand the growth of a tree and the local motion, gravity, we can glean something about what are the principles of human love. That's the view, and it's an ancient one, but it's also contemporary poets. The Nobel laureate Octavio Paz says that as he was entering into the new millennium, that he saw convergence emerging between the sciences and poetry about just this particular notion. Okay, so whether it is ultimately helpful to describe the principles of animal action and of inanimate motion as types of love, that's a legitimate question. It should not, however, distract us from Aquinas' central insight. Human love shares important features in common with the principles underlying the actions of other natural things. What, however, is this common element? In local motion, the motion presupposes a capacity or potency to move in a certain way, to a certain spot. I can walk across the room, but I cannot fly across the room. Okay. So there's that notion of capacity. Yet capacity alone does not seem sufficiently to convey the common character of love. For although someone may have the capacity to be someplace, such as prison, we wouldn't want to call this potency for prison a love for prison. The element of love that is common to other things would seem to be reserved for what are commonly called natural motions. A stone falling to the earth, an acorn becoming a tree, becoming an oak, or the deer longing for flowing streams. These are all motions that are traditionally described as natural. What these cases add to the general notion of capacity is affinity or inclination. The deer has an affinity for clean, clear water. The acorn has an affinity or an inclination toward becoming an oak. And after Einstein and field theory, general relativity, we can once again say that the stone has a certain affinity for the earth toward which it moves. St. Thomas uses several different terms to convey love's affinity. Affinitas, aptitudo, connaturalitas, convenientia, or inclinatio. But in the case of human love, both in the emotions and in the will, Aquinas prefers complacencia. We can maybe discuss why that might be at the break. The contemporary English word complacency does not, however, convey the meaning of the Latin term. For Aquinas, complacencia is the Latin equivalent of the Greek eudokia, which literally means satisfaction or approval, and regularly conveys the notion of being well-pleasing, well-pleasing, of being a pleasing, affective affinity for some object judged to be good, whether in action a person or a thing. Aquinas thus defines love in the following way. The first change caused in our affectivity by the desired object is called love, and is nothing else than complacencia for the desired object. This definition is a summation of a much fuller account that explicitly distinguishes between the emotional love proper to the passions and the spiritual or rational love proper to the will. In both cases, love is the principle of all subsequent motion, whether of the emotions or of the actions that flow from our rational decisions, and is nothing other than a certain pleasing affective affinity for the good. But if love is the principle of human affectivity, what is the character of the actions that flow from it? Normally, when we speak of love, we refer to an activity, whether an action or a passion, and not merely, if at all, to the principle underlying the activity. We speak of desiring something or of willing something for someone. Aquinas accounts for this experience by developing the following schema. In the emotions, love is desire when the loved object is absent, and pleasure when the loved object is present. He's getting this from Book 14 of the City of God. In the will, the act of love is to will some good for someone, for oneself or for another, when that good is absent, and to delight or rejoice in that good when it is present. As Joseph Pieper explains, the primary good we will for another is that he or she exist. To love them is, on the most fundamental level, is to affirm it is good that you exist, it is good that you are in this world. Now, it's important to note for those who are interested in the history of all this, Aquinas is only able to develop that notion of the will's primary act of love being to will the good for another, because he was among the first generation that had access to Aristotle's rhetoric. And it's in the rhetoric where Aristotle gives the definition of what the act of philein, so the act proper to love, the act of friendship love, he gives it there, to will, to want for the other what you think is best for the other. Anyway, so it's only with the rhetoric that Aquinas is able to develop this idea of the will's act in love. So, we then will and promote other goods for them. So the first primary act is to will good for the other, will that they're in this world. When we then will and promote other goods for them, that they be virtuous, healthy, and wise. When our beloved is present and enjoying all of these goods, we rejoice in the beloved and his or her good. All these acts of love, however, presuppose a certain affective affinity for the loved object at the outset. This is true of our love for people or for things, whether on the spiritual or material level. One wouldn't desire truffles, for example, or find them pleasurable to eat unless one already had a certain affinity for them. Or Brussels sprouts. What we call Brussels, choux Bruxelles in French, yes, Brussels. What's the Flemish for Brussels sprouts? Okay, so if they're well prepared, if you've grown up with them, when you smell them, you are drawn to them. But if you don't like them and you smell them, you have an aversion for them. So the desire for Brussels sprouts presupposes that affinity. And Aquinas is looking for that principle to then understand the actions that flow from it. Likewise, although one can do good deeds for another, these actions won't be considered acts of love unless they spring from a certain spiritual affection and affinity for that person. But how does any of this help us understand the plight of Maitri and his serial wives? Specifically, how does a theory that emphasizes love's role as a principle of action, love as complacencia, help us to understand the confusing relationship between love and the will and love and the passions, between love as directed will and love as cliff jumping? To answer this question, we must look more closely at the unique character of spiritual love. Aquinas distinguishes the complacentia present in the will from that which is present in the affectivity of lower animals by affirming that love in the will is the result of our own choices. This is why, he explains, although amor is the general Latin term for love, dilectio is most properly the Latin word for love in the will, because spiritual love presupposes a choice, electio. One of the peculiarities of Latin that makes it difficult for Latins to develop a theology of love is that there's no verbal form of caritas. Agape, which is caritas is normally used to translate agape, there's a verb, agapan. So there's a verbal form of agape and the noun, but there is no verbal form of caritas. So the choice to translate, for example, Jerome, when the verb agape is used in the New Testament, he almost universally uses the word, both the noun and the verbal form of dilectio, deligere. Okay, and so Aquinas is pointing out that that particular word for love implies a preceding choice. We choose those whom we love. We choose those in whom we wish to be well pleased and to whom we wish to will good. Now, there's a lot of complexity there, but I think the key thing for Aquinas' psychology is no matter how we're feeling, a man may find his mother-in-law annoying on the emotional level, a lot of things that make him not even want to be around her, but for love of his wife, he can choose to place his mother-in-law in his spiritual affections, and therefore having that chosen complacencia for her, that can then direct all of his actions that he does towards her from charity. Now, what we're going to look at later is that action can also then change his psychology, so that the other part of his psychology that was in tension with that can slowly come around. It's like a person who, I've known people who, women who've never followed football, for example, or American football, gridiron, but because of their love for their husband or their future husband, they start to attend football games, and then they become more fans than their spouses because of that activity shared together. So that's some of what we're going to go on to look at. All right, so the preceding choice. We choose those whom we love. We choose those in whom we wish to be well pleased and to whom we wish to will good. The emotional aspect of human love, however, are more complicated. Although Thomas recognizes that our emotions share somewhat in human freedom by being partially under the direction of reason, he also holds that our emotions only sustain us in our choices when they are well ordered. As the long history of human experience reveals, a person's passions are frequently disordered, and these disordered affections can push us away from our commitments. This is part of what troubles Dillard's lovelorn protagonist. In the abstract, we may wish to remain faithful to our first love, but then another who is more appealing to our emotions arrives, and a veritable storm of passion buffets us toward this second love. If our passions are well ordered, on the other hand, the emotional reaction caused by this second love can be slight. We might feel them, but they would not move us to act, because deeper emotions would continue to sustain us in our first choice, our first love. This is the ideal. Will and emotion, action and passion, occurring in harmony to sustain us in our loves. Far too often, however, we either experience our emotions as buffeting us towards contrary actions and conflicting goods, or inexplicably, our emotions desert us. After years of smooth sailing with our beloved, suddenly the winds of passion drop. In such a state, we become vulnerable to any new emotion, provoked by someone new in our lives. This is how Dillard portrays Maytree's plight after years of happy marriage. Love's first passion was no longer sustaining love's first choice. The question thus becomes, how can we train our passions to support our choices? In other words, how do we become people whose emotional loves support their spiritual loves? For Thomas Aquinas, it is by growing in the traits of character he calls virtues that we order our passions aright and thereby develop an integrated personality. On the deepest level, the capacity to remain true to our choices is a gift of grace. This gift penetrates, elevates, and heals the powers of the soul, intellect, will, and emotions, through the infused virtues. On the one hand, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity offer the triune God as our intimate end, in whom all our actions come to rest and find fulfillment. On the other hand, the infused dispositions that Aquinas describes as the infused cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, courage, and temperance dispose us to act aright concerning those actions that are integral to the gospel and thus necessary for our salvation. A full account of Thomas's theology of the infused cardinal virtues is beyond the scope of these brief reflections. But two features are worthy of note. First, although the infused cardinal virtues empower us to do what virtue demands, and to remain faithful in our loves, they do not immediately heal and integrate our passions. In other words, although the grace of conversion empowers us to live the gospel, we still may struggle under the residual effects of our acquired vices and disordered affections. This points to the second feature of Aquinas' account. It is only by living according to the gospel, by repeatedly engaging in acts of virtue and of faithful love, that our passions become integrated and start to support the choices underlying our spiritual love. The example of the mother-in-law. It's only by repeatedly choosing to place her in our spiritual affections and doing acts of charity towards her that the emotional revulsion that we may have long experienced because of her attitude and the way she treats us, that begins to be healed. And so that our whole emotional life is engaged in loving that distasteful person in our life. Specifically, it is by engaging in acts of charity that our passions gradually advance in the long process of integration. Ideally, a person's emotional love for his beloved will become a deep burning charcoal, warmly sustaining the choices of his spiritual love. There's that quote, it's attributed to Unamuno, but I've never been able to find it, that says that, looking back after 60 years of marriage, that he's no longer stirred by his wife's body, but when her leg hurts, so does his. So there's a deepening. The love may not be as flashily visible as when they were first married, but it is much more deeply burning down in the coals of their being. But what concretely do we mean by living the gospel or engaging in acts of charity? Far too often, our understanding of what charity entails has been shaped by an angelic individualism that forgets that when we love, even with the spiritual love of charity, we do so as animals, as rational animals, but as animals nonetheless. Acts of charity, therefore, only promote emotional integration to the extent that they are done in a fully human way, in a way that respects our animal nature. It is here that recent research in clinical and experimental psychology can help us understand the lasting value of Aquinas' theory of love. Although we should not reduce the dynamics of charity to the life of grace merely to the quantitative level proper to the behavioral sciences, grace nevertheless presupposes nature. We live charity's love in and through a concrete, genetic, familial, and cultural context that influences our emotional life. Since, in Aquinas' view, the spiritual love property of the will acts in and through the emotions, whatever shapes our emotions will influence, for good or ill, how we love with the love of charity. Whatever clinical and experimental psychology can tell us about the dynamics of emotional love, therefore, can deepen our understanding of the relationship between love as a passion and love as a choice. So, love and the psychological sciences. The research I wish to briefly to consider with you, because the field is vast and often conflicting, concerns the mechanisms of what I've described, mechanisms of emotional attachment. Specifically, Thomas Lewis and his colleagues, Fari Amani and Richard Lannon, at the University of California, San Francisco, study the dynamics of what they call limbic, but what I think is better to call emotional resonance. Emotional resonance, emotional regulation, and emotional revision. 3 features. Infants, so first, emotional resonance. Infants, from the moment of their birth, respond to human emotion. Matter of fact, they're already responding to it in the womb. They very quickly recognize the expressions of the human face and learn to respond according to the primary emotions of these facial expressions convey. At the same time, parents, especially mothers, are able to read the emotional states of their infants. This is what researchers describe as limbic or emotional resonance. This ability is present only in mammals, which are the only creatures to have a limbic brain structured above the reptilian brain. Birds are a kind of halfway house, but mammals are the only ones that have the fully respond emotionally with this resonance. Researchers have aptly described this emotional resonance as a symphony of mutual exchange and internal adaptation that enables mammals to become attuned to each other's inner states. You see this in prey animals. When one horse in the herd is stressed, the whole herd picks up. They feel it. There's something up. They know there's something wrong. Okay. It is what underlies, quote, the wordless harmony we take for granted around us. The harmony between, quote, between mother and infant, between a boy and his dog, between lovers holding hands across a restaurant table. It is part of what accounts for the unique character of collective activities. Why do people go to rock concerts? What are they experiencing that they can't experience at home? One person's thoughts don't change the atmosphere in a room, but his emotional state can. Quote, limbic states can leap between minds. Feelings are contagious. The limbic activity of those around us draws our emotions into almost immediate congruence. Lewis and his colleagues explain that this is what gives communal experiences of the arts such intense emotional vibrancy. When we watch a film in a crowded theater, we are drawn into the emotional experiences of wonder, fear, joy, sorrow, and anticipation, the intensity of which is lacking when we view the film alone, at home, or on our phone. Emotional resonance is also what underlies the fight or flight mechanism that can cause a herd to flee or a mob to attack. More soothingly, these researchers explain that this resonance transforms the simple act of silently being attentive in a room. When you are silent with another or with others, quote, another world expands and comes alive to your senses, a world governed by forces that were old before humanity began, unquote. Our emotions not only resonate, they also regulate, the second part. As the above descriptions imply, our emotional reactions shape and are shaped by the emotional reactions of others. This emotional regulation is part of a larger animal synergy. Mammals, it turns out, have nervous systems that require the presence of other mammals in order for these systems to develop and to function properly. Quote, the human body constantly fine-tunes many thousands of physiologic parameters. But because human physiology is, at least in part, an open loop arrangement, an individual does not direct all of his own functions. A second person transmits regulatory information that can alter hormone levels, cardiovascular function, sleep rhythms, immune functions, and more inside the body of the first. The reciprocal process occurs simultaneously. The first person regulates the physiology of the second, even as he himself is regulated. Neither is a functioning whole on his own. Each has open loops that only somebody else can complete. The work that's been done in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st is remarkable in terms of, for example, a child, an infant, will turn towards the adult in the room and regulate its breathing according to the breathing of the adult. Because, of course, one of the things that can't develop in the womb is breathing. So that they need to learn to breathe in the proper way in the presence of others who breathe. And that's just with breathing, but this is about the emotions and how we react to our environment. This occurs on the deepest level between a mother and her infant child. Not only does the child's nervous system develop in imitation of the mother, the child learns to respond emotionally to his environment from the emotional response of his mother to this environment. As the child grows, the network of people whose emotions regulate his emotional life expands. His father, other caregivers, and other members of the family all influence his emotions. It is here that the child learns what it means to love and be loved. It is also during these years that these primary caregivers imprint patterns of attraction and attachment upon his emotional memory. These emotional attractors will shape a child's sense of what is normal and influence his future choice of friends as well as his future experiences of romantic attraction. This process occurs well or badly. How many times have we heard someone say, well, I'm never going to marry a drunk, and then they end up marrying someone who, because of their personality, maybe when they got married, neither of them drank, and yet they ended up being drawn to someone who is going to respond well, not going to be respond well to alcohol. They're drawn by their family of origin to the same type of people who have the same fragilities. Now, a full account of emotional regulation would trace how healthy lovers raise children who will be disposed as adults to love this way and to seek the company of others who do the same. It would also explain how those raised by disordered and neurotic lovers will be drawn, in spite of themselves, to just this sort of disordered lover as adults. As we have seen, however, Annie Dillard in The Matrices is not primarily concerned with the dynamics of falling in love, but with the difficulty of remaining faithful to those whom we have chosen to love. The mystery of Toby Matrice's abandonment of Lou is our concern this evening. For our purposes, therefore, two features of emotional regulation deserve attention. First, emotional regulation is not merely a childhood phenomenon. Quote, adults remain social animals. They continue to require a source of stabilization outside themselves. That open loop design means that in some important ways, people cannot be stable on their own. Not should or shouldn't be, but cannot be. In order for our emotional lives to have the stability necessary to support us in our choices, we need the help of others. It is not just their opinions that we need the influence of their healthy emotional lives. In other words, faithful love requires communities of faithful love, communities where people love the right things and love them well. Secondly, the chemistry that establishes emotional regulation also makes emotional revision possible. So there's the third feature, emotional revision, which Lewis and his colleagues describe as, quote, the power to remodel the emotional parts of the people we love. Although our early childhood formation disposes us to love in certain ways, this formation is not fixed in stone. New loves can change how we love. Quote, in a relationship, one mind revises another. What's the motto of Newman? Heart speaks to heart. So in a relationship, this is the psychologist, in a relationship, one mind revises another. One heart changes its partner, unquote. Lovers, simply from the fact of spending their lives together, reshape each other's emotions. Now, we began this survey of the findings of Lewis, Amani, and Lannon as an aid to understanding how our emotions support our choices. Their research sustains the view that emotional love is formed in community with others. Now, a full account of this complex dynamic would present the work of other researchers. Here, however, I would like to note, as a concluding part of this talk, I would like to note 3 activities that have a privileged role in regulating and revising our emotions. This is traditional, and there's a whole body of research that supports it. What are these 3 activities? Eating, communal eating, a meal, meals, singing, and dancing. Traditional cultures give special attention to all 3 activities. Indeed, as a growing body of research recognizes, the ritualized regularity of familial or communal meals, of singing of songs during the various activities of daily life, as well as communal dancing, all shape a community's emotional and psychological commitments. In traditional societies, it is partly through these activities that the members of the community learn what it is to love and how to love. Contemporary Western societies, however, have reduced these activities to a bare minimum. Although we should avoid holding an idealized view of the past, the fact remains that individuals in contemporary society spend far less time in formal meals and virtually no time singing or dancing with others as compared to previous generations. The loss of communal singing is perhaps the most striking feature of our contemporary emotional impoverishment. As Ted Gioia, so there's Dana Gioia, the poet, but there's Ted Gioia, who was a jazz pianist, and then he's become an expert on music. And he got funding to do these studies of 3 volumes. 2 were published by Yale, 1 by Oxford, work songs, healing songs, and then love songs. And it's an extraordinary accomplishment. Anyway, as Ted Gioia has noted, although we are surrounded by music produced by electronic means, our experience of song has largely become passive. We listen to music, but we rarely sing together. Previous generations, however, sang regularly. They sang together at work and at play, at home and in larger community. They sang while they cared for each other, they sang as they prayed, and they sang as they wooed. We do very little of any of this. Perhaps this is one source of love's inconstancy. In the context of our current inquiry, this research would suggest that one way for Toby Maytree's willful focus of attention to retain something of love's first feeling of cliff jumping would be by surrounding it with emotional supports, by meals spent together, by a life of shared song and dance, and all of this in a communal context larger than themselves. These insights also have implications for how we understand and respond to God's love. The scriptures affirm that God is faithful in his love for us. They affirm further that when we love each other in Christ and in the mystery of his cross, we too can remain true to our first loves. The insights of both Aquinas and contemporary psychology remind us, however, that our emotions will support us in this choice only if we love in a fully human way. This implies incarnating our love for God in the song and dance of daily life. In other words, even our love for God requires the supports provided by the mechanisms of emotional resonance, emotional regulation, and emotional revision. By expressing our love for God each day through the song and dance that is the liturgy, the liturgies of the domestic church, such as vocal prayer and song, the rosary, the psalms, or the great liturgy that is the Eucharist, the sacrificial meal where Christ himself is our nourishment, we shape each other's emotions and engage these emotions in support of our loves. Love's rituals, therefore, both human and divine, provide our answer. They are the communal practices that foster emotions in support of our choices. They are what help us discover the true character of love and to remain faithful to it. Thank you.